At first, it didn't look like a decision at all. There was no announcement, no emergency language, no moment where anyone said this is happening now. What appeared instead was movement, quiet, coordinated, and already in progress. The kind of movement that doesn't ask permission because permission was settled earlier, somewhere out of sight. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was the warning. Procedures activated without comment, assets shifted without explanation, routes shortened, timelines compressed. And the most unsettling part wasn't the scale of what was moving, but the calm precision behind it, as if the outcome had already been accepted and the system had moved on to execution. This is how escalation actually begins, not with threats, but with logistics. Aircraft don't change direction to make a point. Fleets don't reposition for symbolism. They move because the math has changed, because distance is no longer the constraint it used to be. And when support elements start arriving before anyone publicly admits they're required, it usually means the real question is no longer whether action will occur, but how the aftermath will be managed. You can tell when a system crosses that line because familiar words start losing their meaning. Presence, stability, deterrence. They're still being used, but they no longer describe conditions. They describe posture, a way of standing still while everything underneath continues to shift. And it looks harmless until you notice how many unrelated pieces begin aligning at the same time. There's a specific unease that emerges at this stage. Not panic, not fear, something colder. The realization that contingency planning has quietly become baseline planning. That defensive language is being used to justify offensive geometry. That escalation is no longer being prevented, only managed. And once a system reaches that point, restraint stops being a safeguard. It becomes a delay mechanism. Time is no longer being bought to avoid action, but to prepare for what follows it. The movements keep coming. The explanations stay vague. And the silence isn't reassurance anymore. It's confirmation that the decision already happened, just not where you were allowed to see it. What makes this moment different is not the hardware or the numbers. Those can always be explained away. What matters is the sequencing, the order in which things arrive. First the reach, then the endurance, then the protection. That order isn't accidental. It reflects an assumption about response, not intent. And this is where the main thing begins to surface, though nobody says it out loud, because saying it would force a choice. And choices at this level are usually delayed as long as possible, until delay itself becomes the decision. There are warnings being issued now, but they don't sound like warnings. They sound like clarifications, as if one side is making sure the other understands that familiar categories no longer apply. That there will be no neat boundaries, no calibrated gestures, no limited versions of what comes next. At this point, the system usually hesitates. It looks for a pause, a signal, anything that can be interpreted as permission to step back. But what if that signal never comes? What if the preparations themselves are the message? Because when enough pieces are put in place to handle the aftermath, the initial act stops being the risk. The risk becomes stopping, and that's where everything feels suddenly unstable. Not because something has happened, but because too much has already been set in motion to pretend nothing will. From that point on, the logic changes. What looks like accumulation is actually synchronization. Each movement starts making sense only when viewed as part of a larger mechanism, one that assumes friction, resistance, and retaliation as givens rather than possibilities. The key shift is not in firepower, but in architecture. Systems designed to strike are useless without systems designed to sustain. Reach means nothing without refueling. Precision collapses without targeting persistence. And deterrence only works if survival after the first exchange has already been planned. That is the layer most people miss, because it doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures. It arrives quietly, under the label of preparedness. This is where the system stops asking who started what. Instead, it begins mapping how escalation behaves once it's underway. How many nodes are exposed? Which corridors become choke points? Which bases turn from assets into liabilities the moment the first response is launched? At that stage, the concern is no longer whether an action is justified, but whether the network can absorb the shock. There is a reason defensive elements are positioned alongside offensive ones, not after. Alongside. That sequencing implies an expectation of immediacy. It assumes that any strike, however framed, will trigger a cascade that cannot be paused mid-flight. The system is preparing not for a reaction, but for simultaneous exchange across multiple domains. And this is where language starts to fail. Terms like limited and surgical lose operational meaning once counter-responses are treated as automatic. When one side formally discards the idea of proportionality, the other has to decide whether it believes that declaration or treats it as theater. Planning suggests it is being taken literally. At this level, escalation is no longer about messages. It's about timelines, how fast defenses can reload, how long runways remain usable, how many hours command centers can function under sustained pressure. These are not political questions. They are mechanical ones, and they force planners into uncomfortable assumptions about duration and depth. Another signal appears here, one that usually goes unnoticed: the involvement of actors whose primary role is not attack, but containment. They exist to keep routes open, to prevent secondary collapse, to ensure that global systems don't seize up while regional ones burn. Their presence suggests that the scenario being modeled extends beyond the immediate theater. This is where allies become variables rather than partners. Hosting turns into exposure. Geography becomes destiny. States that believed they were buffers begin to realize they are now surfaces. And the quiet warnings circulating through diplomatic channels are less about loyalty than about survivability. The system is now operating on the premise that any engagement will not remain confined, that energy flows, markets react, and narratives fragment faster than control can be reasserted. The preparations reflect an understanding that once the threshold is crossed, managing the consequences becomes the primary mission. What's unsettling is how normalized this all appears inside the machinery. No urgency, no visible debate, just execution of plans that have clearly been waiting for a moment when restraint could be reframed as risk. And at this stage, the most dangerous assumption settles in. That because everything is prepared, everything is therefore manageable. History suggests this is usually the point where the margin for error disappears, not with a bang, but with a silent narrowing of options. Because once systems are aligned for impact, stepping back is no longer neutral. It becomes an action of its own, and not everyone in the system agrees on how dangerous that action might be. After that, the conversation stops being abstract. Consequences stop living in briefing rooms and begin appearing in real space with real constraints. Bases are no longer dots on a map. They become fixed targets with fixed coordinates and finite defenses. Supply lines stop being theoretical and start depending on weather, distance, and uninterrupted time. The first thing that changes is tempo. Once the system accepts that escalation will not be contained, speed becomes protection. Decisions compress. Windows close faster than chains of command were designed to handle. What used to be deliberation turns into execution by default. Not because anyone is reckless, but because hesitation introduces vulnerability the system can no longer afford. Then geography asserts itself. Corridors that once served commerce are reclassified as risk zones. Choke points stop being strategic concepts and become operational liabilities. Any disruption there ripples outward, far beyond the immediate conflict. Energy flows tighten. Insurance vanishes. Shipping reroutes not because of direct attack, but because prediction models no longer trust stability. At this point, escalation doesn't need new orders. It feeds on response. One interception triggers reinforcement. Reinforcement invites saturation. Saturation forces prioritization. And prioritization always leaves something exposed. The system knows this. That's why it has already begun calculating acceptable losses rather than preventable ones. The idea of control quietly degrades here. Not collapse, but dilution. Each additional layer of defense creates new dependencies. Each contingency plan assumes other systems hold. But complex systems rarely fail cleanly. They fail sideways, through overload, through misinterpretation, through timing mismatches that no simulation fully captures. What makes this stage irreversible is not the first strike, but the loss of shared framing. When one side defines every action as total, the other must decide whether restraint is wisdom or weakness. That decision doesn't stay theoretical for long. It manifests in posture, readiness, and trigger sensitivity. And once those shift, rollback becomes structurally difficult. There is also the civilian layer, often mentioned last and planned for first. Population centers that were never meant to factor into calculations suddenly do. Air defense inventories thin. Warning times shrink. The distinction between military and economic targets blurs under pressure, not intent. And systems designed to reassure begin amplifying anxiety instead. At this point, even silence becomes dangerous. Not because it hides intent, but because it invites assumption. Markets move on rumors. Allies reposition without coordination. Adversaries test boundaries to see if thresholds still exist. And each test reduces the credibility of the idea that anyone is fully in control. This is usually where history later claims inevitability. But from inside the moment, it doesn't feel inevitable. It feels procedural, like a sequence of necessary adjustments made under the belief that someone, somewhere, still has room to stop it. The problem is that room only exists when not everyone is already prepared for impact. And when preparation becomes indistinguishable from commitment, the system enters a zone where outcomes are no longer chosen. They are endured. Beyond the immediate military geometry, there is a second layer that rarely makes it into open discussion, because it sits at the intersection of force and irreversibility. Once large-scale deployments reach this density, they stop being tools of choice and become facts on the ground that shape behavior on their own. One of the least discussed consequences is command compression. When assets from multiple domains operate in overlapping spaces, the tolerance for misinterpretation collapses. Radar tracks merge, signals overlap, identification windows shrink. In such environments, the difference between a probe and a prelude is often measured in minutes, not intent. This is where systems designed for deterrence begin behaving like accelerants. Another structural issue is saturation logic. Modern air and missile defense is not built to be impermeable. It is built to be selective. It assumes prioritization under stress. That assumption becomes dangerous when both sides plan around overwhelming the filter rather than avoiding it. Once saturation becomes a baseline expectation, every additional platform added to the theater raises the probability of uncontrolled spillover rather than reducing it. There is also the question of endurance. High-intensity operations consume resources at a rate that peacetime planning rarely internalizes. Interceptors are finite. Maintenance cycles are unforgiving. Crews degrade. Decision fatigue sets in long before equipment fails. The longer the posture is sustained, the more pressure shifts from strategy to logistics. And logistics failures are rarely dramatic. They manifest as delays, gaps, and cascading compromises. Politically, this stage creates a paradox. Leaders gain more options on paper while losing flexibility in practice. Once allies adjust their own defenses, once markets price in disruption, once civilian populations adapt psychologically to the expectation of impact, reversing course becomes politically costly. De-escalation starts to look like retreat, even when it is rational. There is also an external audience that matters more than official statements admit. Other powers are not watching the rhetoric, they are watching thresholds, how quickly they are crossed, how clearly they are defined, and how much damage is tolerated before restraint reappears. Those observations don't stay theoretical. They feed directly into future calculations elsewhere. This is why the most consequential outcome may not be what happens in the immediate theater, but what becomes normalized afterward. If total response becomes the accepted framing, then every future crisis inherits that logic. Escalation ladders flatten, warning phases shorten, the space between pressure and force narrows permanently. At this point, the system is no longer preparing for a single confrontation. It is recalibrating expectations for conflict itself. That shift does not announce itself with declarations. It settles in quietly through posture, readiness, and the silent acceptance that certain red lines may no longer function as brakes. And once that acceptance takes hold, stability doesn't collapse all at once. It thins, it stretches, until one day, under conditions that look routine on the surface, it simply fails to hold.